Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I still remember the day as clearly as if it happened this morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of warm chamomile tea between my hands, staring through the window at a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or brighten. It was one of those quiet afternoons where the house felt too still, and every small sound, like the ticking clock or the faint rumble of a car passing outside, seemed louder than usual. I was thinking about nothing in particular, just letting the day drift, when my phone lit up and buzzed across the table. I didn't think much of it at first. My brother's boy, Daniel, would call every so often, usually to ask me something simple like a recipe or to check on the family. He'd always been thoughtful like that. But that day, the way my phone vibrated felt different. It's funny how a moment can feel heavier even before you know why. When I answered and heard the small hesitation in his breath before he spoke, I knew this wasn't going to be the usual quick chat. "Aunt Marie, do you have a minute?" His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, with a weight behind it that made my heart tighten. I could tell he'd been holding something inside, something he wasn't sure how to say. And in that instant, the whole atmosphere of the room shifted for me. The tea didn't taste the same. The sky outside suddenly looked darker. Even the familiar hum of the refrigerator felt like it was fading into the background. "Of course, sweetheart. What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and warm. He didn't answer right away. Instead, there was this long pause, the kind that stretches out just enough to let your mind wander into places you'd rather not go. I could hear him breathing, steady but slow, like he was preparing himself. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a low, trembling rhythm. I didn't know who else to call. That alone was enough to stir something deep inside me. It's a powerful thing when someone chooses you, out of everyone in their life, to confide in. I straightened up in my chair without realizing it, bracing myself. I could hear the emotions sitting behind his words, gently pressing forward, but not yet spilling out. He told me he'd been struggling with things he didn't feel comfortable talking about with his father. Things that made him feel unsure about his place in the world. The way he said it wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, careful, almost fragile. And as he spoke, I could picture him sitting somewhere alone, probably with his shoulders hunched the way he always did when something bothered him. I remembered him as a boy, running around my backyard with grass stains on his knees, laughing at everything and worrying about nothing. Hearing him sound so grown and yet so vulnerable felt like watching a chapter of his life turn right in front of me. I listened, letting him get each piece out at his own pace. I didn't interrupt, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. Sometimes silence can be the most comforting thing you offer someone, just the sound of your presence on the other end of the line. And as he opened up, something unexpected happened inside me too. A kind of warmth spread through me, not the simple warmth of affection, but something deeper, something that made me aware of how meaningful these moments can be when life slows down enough for them to happen. The more he shared, the more the room around me faded. It was just his voice and my heartbeat, steady and present, grounding both of us. I could tell he wasn't looking for advice, not really. He just needed someone to hear him without judgment, someone who remembered him not as the man he felt pressured to be now, but as the boy he once was. When he paused again, I gently asked him to tell me what had brought all this up. He took another breath, one that sounded like it carried weeks of weight, maybe even months. Then he finally said something I never expected, a quiet confession that touched something deep in me, something I didn't even know was waiting to be touched. And that was the moment everything shifted between us, not in a way that crossed any lines, but in a way that made us both more aware of the closeness we shared, the kind built slowly over years of small conversations, family dinners, and the unspoken trust that grows from really knowing someone. I didn't know then how much this phone call would stay with me. But as I sat there, listening to him open his heart in a way he'd never done before, I felt the beginning of a story I still think about to this day. For a second after his confession, I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't know how to answer, but because I wanted to make sure he felt the space to breathe after spilling out something that had clearly been sitting on his chest for far too long. I could almost picture him on the other end of the line, eyes lowered, waiting for me to react, probably afraid he'd shared too much. I could feel the weight of the moment like a warm pressure against my ribs. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said, my voice steady and low. "I'm glad you called. And I meant it, not out of obligation, not because I wanted to fix anything, but because trust like that is rare, especially between adults who have drifted into separate lives but still carry pieces of each other through the years." He let out a breath that sounded shaky, almost relieved. Then he said something I didn't expect. I didn't know who else would understand. The way he said it made something inside me shift again. Not in a dramatic way, but gently, like a curtain being pulled back to reveal a part of him I'd never seen before, a part he'd been guarding. I leaned back in my chair, the wooden edge pressing lightly against my shoulder blades. Outside, the clouds had settled into a darker gray, the kind that makes the world look softer and quieter. I wrapped my hands around my warm mug and listened as he tried to put his feelings into words. He spoke slowly, pausing often, like he was choosing each sentence with care. He talked about stress, loneliness, expectations, things most people don't admit out loud, especially not young men trying to prove they're strong. And then he said something that caught me completely off guard. "When I'm around you," he whispered, "I feel like I can finally breathe." His voice trembled, honest and unfiltered. I didn't know if he realized how deeply his words landed. I felt my breath catch, just slightly, and my fingers tightened around the mug before I relaxed my grip. That kind of openness, that kind of trust, it can stir emotions you didn't expect. I had always cared about him, watched him grow, cheered for him quietly from the sidelines of life. But hearing the young man he become speak with such vulnerability, it made me see him differently. Not as my brother's boy, not as the child I used to babysit, but as someone trying to find a steady hand to hold onto in a moment of confusion. "Daniel," I said softly, making sure every word carried steadiness. "Everyone deserves a place where they can feel safe. You're allowed to feel overwhelmed. You're allowed to need someone." I could hear him swallow, hear the tiny exhale he didn't mean for me to catch. It made me feel protective in a way that surprised me. He apologized again, unnecessarily, and I reassured him gently. "You didn't do anything wrong by telling me how you feel." And it was true. Nothing about his openness felt out of place. If anything, it felt overdue, like he'd been walking around with a story half told and had finally found the courage to share it. The conversation deepened naturally after that. He told me about the pressures he'd been carrying alone, how he'd been second-guessing himself in ways he'd never confessed to anyone else. The honesty between us created a space that felt strangely warm, almost like the air in the room had thickened with meaning. I found myself speaking in the same quiet tone I used with people who needed comfort, slow, careful, but genuine. A gentle closeness grew between us, the kind that doesn't cross lines but acknowledges them with respect. It was an emotional closeness, a shared understanding that felt grounding rather than confusing. A moment where two people, one older, one younger, stood on common ground made of trust. When he paused again, he asked me a simple question that somehow felt deeper than the words themselves. "Can I keep talking to you like this?" It was such a tender moment, so hesitant and sincere, that I felt my chest warm. "Of course," I said. "Whenever you need to talk, I'm here." There was another silence after that, but this one was different, softer, comforting, almost peaceful. It felt like the kind of silence that happens when two people finally understand each other without needing more words. And little did I know, that was only the beginning of what that phone call would become in my memory, something I'd return to more times than I ever expected. After that gentle silence settled between us, I shifted in my chair and felt the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath me. The house was still, almost as if it, too, was listening. I could hear the faint patter of rain beginning against the windows, soft and steady, like a quiet drumbeat under our conversation. It added a certain warmth to the moment, a sense of being tucked inside while something important unfolded. "Are you still there?" he asked after a few seconds, his voice low, almost cautious. "I'm here," I said, and something in those two words seemed to ease him again. There was a softness in the air, a closeness shaped not by anything inappropriate, but by the simple awareness of two people sharing a rare kind of honesty. And as he continued talking, it became clear that he hadn't felt heard in a very long time. He told me about nights spent lying awake, replaying old decisions, worrying about disappointing people he cared about. He talked about moments of doubt that had followed him like shadows. What struck me most wasn't what he said, but how he said it, tentatively, like someone who wasn't used to taking up emotional space. As I listened, I felt something shift gently inside me. Not a romantic feeling, not anything that crossed a boundary, but a deep human tenderness, the kind that surfaces when someone trusts you enough to show you the fragile parts of themselves. I felt protective of him, not the way you protect a child, but the way you protect someone standing on uncertain ground. "Daniel," I said quietly, "you don't have to hide from me. You never did." There was a long pause, the kind that carries meaning even without sound. Then he let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for years. "I wish I had talked to you sooner," he whispered. I think I would have felt less alone." Those words lingered in the air, warm and heavy. I turned slightly in my chair, letting the rain's rhythm steady my breathing. I didn't want him to feel ashamed of sharing. I wanted him to feel supported, understood, grounded. "You're not alone," I said softly. "You haven't been. You just needed the right moment, and the right person to say it to." He grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't hesitation, it was contemplation. I could sense him taking in my words, almost holding them in his hands. And then, unexpectedly, he asked something that caught me off guard, not in a dramatic way, but in a deeply emotional one. "Why is it easier to talk to you than anyone else?" The question wasn't flirtatious or forward. It was genuine, vulnerable. I sat back and closed my eyes for a moment, thinking, why was it easier? Maybe because I'd always seen him clearly, even when he didn't see himself. Maybe because life sometimes chooses unexpected pairs of people to understand each other. I said, choosing my words carefully, "You and I have always had a way of understanding each other. Some connections aren't loud, they're just steady." He didn't respond immediately, but the silence felt full of trust, full of something quietly meaningful. When he finally spoke again, his voice had softened almost to a murmur. "When you talk to me like that, it calms me." His honesty made my chest warm in a way that was emotional, not physical. It made me aware of how much we both needed this. Him, someone to speak freely to. Me, a reminder that my presence still mattered to someone in a deep personal way. The conversation drifted naturally after that. He asked how I had handled difficult moments in my own life, how I had managed times when I felt unsure. I shared small stories, nothing dramatic, just honest pieces of my journey. And he listened with a focus that surprised me. It felt like we were meeting each other anew, not as aunt and nephew, not as adult and young man, but as two people sharing truths in a rare moment of mutual understanding. Minutes turned into longer minutes. The rain grew heavier. The room around me faded until it felt like it was just his voice and mine, floating in a soft pocket of quiet connection. At one point he said, almost in a whisper, "You make things feel less scary." Those words touched me deeply, not because they were emotional, but because they revealed how heavy his burden had been, and how much he had needed someone to simply be there without judgment. "I'm glad," I replied softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." What neither of us realized yet was that this conversation, this simple phone call, was shaping something neither of us had expected, a deeply emotional moment that would stay with us far longer than either of us understood at the time. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. And before I continue, tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing the places that join me for these memories I share. The rain had softened back into a gentle drizzle by the time Daniel stopped talking. It tapped lightly against the windows, steady and rhythmic, like nature itself was keeping time with our conversation. I sat there with my phone pressed to my ear, sensing that we were approaching the end of something, yet also the beginning of something new. A kind of understanding that doesn't arrive loudly, but settles in quietly, the way dusk settles over a familiar neighborhood. He let out a long breath. I could hear the slight catch in it, the way someone sounds when they've finally released what they've been holding inside for far too long. "I feel lighter," he said softly, just saying all that out loud. "I'm glad," I replied, and my voice came out warmer than I intended. Not the warm you give a child to soothe them, but the warm you give someone who has trusted you with something fragile. There was another brief pause on his end, and then he said something I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. "You know, I didn't just call because I was overwhelmed." His voice lowered, gentle and searching. "I called because I missed talking to you." It wasn't an inappropriate admission. It wasn't crossing any boundaries. It was simply honest, and it struck me with a quiet force I wasn't expecting. I felt something shift inside me, something subtle but undeniably real. Not romantic, not confusing, but deeply human. A recognition of the space we had always held for one another, even when life moved us in different directions. "I've missed you too," I admitted. It felt good to say it. Honest. True. He grew quiet again. I could almost picture the expression he might have worn. Thoughtful, maybe even a little emotional. Daniel had always carried his feelings quietly, the way some people carry delicate things in their pockets without wanting anyone to notice. "You were always the person I could talk to without feeling judged," he said. "Even when I was younger, I always felt like you saw the best in me." Those words settled into me with surprising tenderness. I didn't know he'd felt that way all these years. I remembered birthdays, weekend visits, moments when I'd seen him struggling with things no one else seemed to notice. I had always tried to be a steady presence for him, even in small ways. I never knew it had meant this much. "Well," I said softly, "the best in you was always easy to see." I heard him breathe in, slow, steady, like he was taking in more than just the words. Like he was absorbing the comfort behind them. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, almost grounding. The kind of silence that comes only after two people have said everything they needed to say. Then, in a tone that carried a quiet vulnerability, he asked, "Can I call you again? Not just when something's wrong, but when I just want to talk." Something in that question touched me in a way I didn't expect. It was gentle and sincere, the kind of question someone only asks when they truly value the connection. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "You can call me anytime." I could hear the relief in the small breath he let out. It wasn't dramatic, but it was genuine, like he had been afraid of losing the closeness we'd unlocked over the past hour. We talked a little longer after that, about small things, his work, my day, the weather. It felt calmer now, easier, like the emotional weight had finally lifted between us. When he finally said he should go, his voice had softened into something steady and warm. "Thank you," he said before hanging up, "for everything." After the call ended, I stayed there by the window for a long time. The rain had stopped completely, leaving behind that fresh, quiet feeling that always follows a storm. The room smelled faintly of tea and rain-soaked air. The house felt different now, less empty, more alive, as if the conversation had left a warmth lingering in the walls. I touched the phone screen gently, then set it down. Something meaningful had happened. Something emotional, unexpected, and deeply human. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a grand confession. It was simply a connection, one that reminded me how powerful it is when someone chooses you as their safe place. And in that moment, sitting in the soft afterglow of that phone call, I realized why it stayed with me all these years. Because sometimes the moments that matter most aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones, where two people see each other clearly, speak honestly, and walk away a little more understood, a little less alone, and somehow changed in a way neither of them fully expected. And that is why I still think about that phone call to this day.